President Donald Trump called the opioid epidemic in the United States an emergency on Thursday.
The opioid crisis is an emergency, and I'm saying officially right now it is an emergency. It's a national emergency. We're going to spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of money on the opioid crisis.
Though President Trump declared an official state of emergency, the president offered little in the way of concrete solutions to the crisis, which has already claimed thousands of lives. Wednesday, we showed you in depth what RT America discovered regarding the opioid epidemic and another health crisis in the making. In several places, we came across dozens and dozens of used needles. In one place, considered to be a wealthier side of town, we even found a used needle just yards from a child playing with her family on the beach. But the question is, if there are more resources now than ever, why is the problem getting worse? RT's Natasha Sweet looks into this growing problem.
Right now, there are 23 million Americans in recovery for being addicted to opioids. Just imagine there are more than 11 million other Americans still struggling with their addiction today. And the way trends are rising, health officials predict that number to increase significantly. There are many moving parts to this equation, and for some, they say it all started in the doctor's office. As the number of Americans abusing opioids continues to increase, many are wondering how we even got here.
They're devastated. I mean, you go around this country and you hear about 18, 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 80-year-olds. I mean, people who get started by a well-meaning physician for a well-appropriate injury.
It's a nightmare that so many people are blindsided by, a vicious cycle taking lives and ripping apart others.
They have surgery, they get started on opioid, then 3, 6, 8 months later, still on the opioid. Now they're addicted or they're dependent, they can't get off, they got to go through detox to get off of it. Well, nobody wants to go through detox. That sounds horrible, and that's not for me, that's for somebody else to go through. Right? It's very, very complicated, web.
A complicated web that, according to Dr. Nelson, began increasing at an alarming rate, in parts because doctors were taught to overprescribe starting in the 1980s. And it also wasn't as widely known of just how addictive these pills were.
More recently has been some efforts to sort of take back some of the liberal opioid prescribing that we had been accustomed to doing or sort of forced to do for the past 20 years.
But now underprescribing has caused many to take pain into their own hands through the use of heroin. But heroin is no stranger to the U.S. Back in the 1970s, black tar, the heroin coming in from Southeast Asia, was all across the country. But things changed in 2010. According to the Office of National Drug Control Policy, roughly 80% of the world's heroin began coming out of Afghanistan.
The poppy production, drugs in Afghanistan are the only industry in Afghanistan. There's no other industry there.
Matthew Ho was stationed in Afghanistan as a Marine Corps captain in 2009. Even losing a friend in the DEA there, he saw firsthand how widespread the business of heroin was in Afghanistan.
If you go down to the border crossing points, you can see the trucks, the fuel trucks that are full of the liquids that are the precursor chemicals, that are all those chemicals that you need to make the drug, the poppy, into heroin. I mean, this is a business.
The country saw a whopping 43% surge in production in 2016, in part from a genetically modified poppy seed introduced from China in 2015. And now things are changing once again. Even with Afghanistan's huge increase in production, according to the DEA's National Drug Assessment, Mexico is now the primary supplier of heroin in the U.S. Similar to heroin, Mexico is now also shipping large amounts of fentanyl. It's a painkiller 80 to 100 times more potent than morphine.
But addiction costs us something else, too. It costs us in dreams that are never fulfilled, in families that are torn apart, in lives that are lost. We don't just measure our success in dollars and cents.
Senator Rob Portman was one of the first in Congress to point out the U.S.'s supplier is slowly switching over to Mexico. He's passed the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, authorizing $181 million in annual spending for drug education, prevention, and treatment. Senator Portman points out the problem of addiction often stems from the exposure to opioids through prescription painkillers.
When you go to a doctor and someone who you trust prescribes opioid pain medication and says, here's 60 Percocets, take this for this oral surgery you've had, you trust that doctor.
And now other lawmakers are joining forces.
17 states have now limited the number of painkillers that doctors can prescribe. Others, like Ohio, Arizona, Connecticut, Delaware, and Massachusetts, are tightening the duration that someone can be prescribed an opioid. In Washington, Natasha Sweet, RT.
All right, for more on this, let's talk with the reporter that's behind that story, Natasha Sweet. Natasha, tell me, how shocking was it for you to be out there on the field and actually find and see all these needles just out in the open like that?
Yeah, Manila, I mean, I couldn't believe my own eyes, and the photographer and I, we were not expecting to see what we saw. I mean, obviously we came there because we were told that there were needles in the area, but we didn't expect everywhere we shot video to come across needles. I mean, we would be standing in one spot and we would be filming, and sure enough, we look down and there are needles at our feet. And as you saw in my first report, it's just really sad to know that there are used needles where children are playing, whether it's the beach or the park. And it's terrifying to know, but it's something that it's very important for us to be aware of.
I mean, definitely after I saw your first part of the story, I look down now as I'm walking because I'm worried that I might step on something myself. Yeah. And just this week, the president has declared a national emergency on the opioid epidemic. What's to come next of that?
Yeah, I mean, we all want to know. Senator Rob Portman, he passed legislation allotting $181 million annually for education and spending, but unfortunately that is not going to end this epidemic. And we know that new lawmakers are passing laws to shorten the duration that people can have opioids. But again, that's not going to help people who are already addicted. And should we be prescribing them at all? I don't know. It's not my decision to make, but it just seems as though people are continually becoming addicted. And the doctor who I interviewed, Dr. Nelson, he mentioned that in the past, in the 80s, they were told to overprescribe because, in fact, doctors were paid more according to patient satisfaction. So, of course, when they were treated and they had no more pain, the doctors were compensated more. And so it seemed like a win-win situation until everyone started becoming addicted. And now we have this huge crisis on our hands, and it's just so sad.
Paid more for their satisfaction. That is an odd thing to hear. Now, you touched on it in your report that fentanyl, very similar to heroin, is now coming up from Mexico. Do we have reason to believe that authorities have a grip on this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. We have a lot of things in place now to help deal with heroin, but now we have fentanyl coming through the border, which is a lot stronger than heroin. And so you might have heard, actually, that drug enforcement officers go into a crime scene dealing with this stuff, and they overdose. And so now if they know it's fentanyl, they have to wear hazmat suits to protect themselves. But unfortunately, a lot of times when they go to a crime scene, they don't know it's fentanyl until after it's been in the lab for a few weeks. So this is an extremely dangerous drug, and a lot of drug smugglers aren't getting caught because you can bring over a far lot less and get paid more money. So you don't need a lot of this drug.
More street value.
Yes, it's very strong. And so it just seems like, unfortunately, there's not a grip on this yet. Hopefully there is soon, but it just seems like we're still in the early stages of fighting this epidemic.
Fascinating report. Thank you so much for filing it, Natasha Sweet.